Welcome, everyone. Today is Sabbath, January 6, 2024, and welcome to 2024 and the first Bible study of the new secular year. We had a little break, and I hope that you enjoyed that break. And today I'd like to get back to our in-depth study of the book of Mark, and we're going to look at Mark 13 today. I want to go into Mark 13 in some depth, and it's going to take at least a couple of lessons and possibly three. We'll just take it as it comes. We'll go slowly, and we'll just read and study leisurely, and we'll do our best to understand what it is that we're reading and see what we can get from the text. So that's going to be over in Mark 13. Just as a quick recap, if you have not seen the lessons covering Mark 11 and Mark 12, at some point you're going to want to go back to those lessons because they provide some very important context regarding Mark 13, and it's very important, particularly regarding the information on the temple in Jerusalem at that time, Herod's temple, the second temple, and what it represented to the people. We'll talk a little bit about that today, but I won't repeat everything I did last couple of sessions, but I want to give you just a little bit of a sense. So I might just do a very quickie review of certain verses. And then we'll go into Mark 13. And as I said, we're going to take it leisurely and we're not going to rush it. And we're going to just enjoy and savor the material that we cover. And before we actually go into the text itself, what I'd like to do is just take a look at a couple of photographs. So you should see that momentarily. And I'm going to show you an artist's reconstruction of the temple complex and the second temple. And this one, we'll just read the caption. This is a model of Jerusalem during the second temple period as seen from the south. And this 1:50 scale model of Jerusalem is in the Israel Museum and is based on the plan of renowned archaeologist Aviona. And then it keeps going from there. Now, this is looking at it at the complex from the south. And you'll notice these doors over here where people would enter when they would come for high days, for feast period, etc. And then, of course, you see the city of David, and then the valleys, the Kidron Valley over here, the Hinnom Valley around here, and to the east of this. So this is looking from the south. Yeah, as seen from the south. And if you look east, you can't see it obviously here, but east would be the Mount of Olives. So is it likely that the disciples, when you look at Mark 13, were they exiting from these doors here? More than likely. And then they would make their way over to the Mount of Olives towards the east. And that's sort of the context. Now, I want to show you another couple of pictures here. So this is as seen from the east and northeast, right? So we were looking from this direction, right? Looking at it from the south. And this is the way that it would have appeared. Excuse me. It would have appeared it would have been further away, of course, but this would have been the angle that you would have seen from the Mount of Olives. To make this a little bit larger. And actually Yahshua and the disciples, I don't know, we don't know from the text, right? But they might have left from here, and rather than from the southern doors, they might have left from this eastern door here. My mind is foggy because these days, of course, this temple does not exist there. You have the Temple Mount, but the temple itself doesn't exist, and there's a cemetery here now, and there's no entrance, obviously, because there's no entrance to the Temple Mount, of which I'm aware here. But then again, I haven't really been to Israel, so I don't know for sure. But I don't think that there is. But Yahshua and the disciples may have exited from here. Who knows? But the bottom line is this appears to be leading towards the direction of the Mount of Olives. So the perspective that we're looking at right now is looking for the Mount of Olives. And the reason I'm making a big deal of the temple is because if it looked anything like this, and and these artist reconstructions, they go by some pretty good information, I would think. So it may have looked similar to this, if not exactly like this. It was very impressive. It was something that was the centerpiece of Judean culture. And from a religious perspective, although people would not likely have articulated it that way, as I've explained in the past, the temple was where it was the concept, so conceptually, it was heaven and earth coming together, right? This is the place where you went in order to have an encounter with Elohim, as well as with your neighbor. And you have all these columns here, right? It's just very imposing. There's these different courtyards, and I won't go through all that right now. Perhaps one day we'll do a more in-depth study about the temple in terms of the construction. But you had a treasury area where they collected money. You had an area within the temple precincts where you, at least by Yahshua's time, where you would have the exchange with the money changers when you'd come into Jerusalem for the holy days. You'd have the proper place for worship in here. There was a section for only Jews, section for only Gentiles, but everyone had some role to play. But by the time of Yahshua's sojourn, and the first time that he appeared on the scene, what I was explaining within the last two sessions was that Gentiles were being increasingly discriminated against. And Yahshua had an obvious problem with this, because his house of prayer is meant to be a house of prayer for all people. And the whole idea is that all nations are to be able to come before Almighty Yahweh, and to prevent certain people of the nations of aligning themselves with Yahweh and his people was just something that was contrary to everything that Yahshua stands for. And he wasn't having it. And he had a serious problem with the money changers, mainly for that reason, because they were occupying space that was supposed to be for the Gentiles who were Elohim fearers coming to the temple to worship, and they weren't able to do that. And there are other reasons as well. The commercialization and the like had gotten probably to a really odious level, and there are other issues as well. And then last session, a couple of weeks ago, I explained the whole idea behind the coin when the rulers of Israel tried to entrap Yahshua, and they tried to see if he would convey a rebellious spirit against Caesar, or contrary to that, if he would be the kind of person that would give in easily and put his faith second place to a pagan ruler. And when Yahshua asked them for the coin, it was a denarius, and one side had the face of Caesar, who at that time would have been Tiberius Caesar, and then the other side had another image of a pagan mighty one. And the writing that was on that coin had to do with Caesar as the son of the divine, the son of God, in other words. And then the other part had to do with high priest, and of course pagan high priest. And Yahshua, these are two things that are obviously in direct contradiction and a direct opposition to Yahshua. And he essentially said, what Caesar's give to Caesar's, and what's Elohim's give to Elohim, which is not necessarily just saying separate, what we would call today in our culture here in the United States, church and state. That's not really what he was getting at. He was actually alluding to a line in First Maccabees, which was the book in the apocryphal writings, which are extra biblical writings, but it gives historical information about how the Jews were persecuted under a ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a Syrian Greek. And because of the policies of Antiochus Epiphanes imposing his will upon the Jewish people, it eventually led to an uprising. And that uprising is given in great account in First, Second Maccabees. Both the persecution that the Jews experienced and that uprising are detailed in Maccabees and in First, Second Maccabees. And then as a result of all that, this is where you had Judah Maccabeus, who was the main leader until he was killed, and then one of his brothers took over. And at some point during this fighting, you have the occasion over 8 days that now is celebrated with Hanukkah, and at the rededication of the temple, as they were starting to gain ground on the Syrian Greeks, and eventually they defeated them. And then from that point on, Judah had some level of autonomy, even as others came in on the scene, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and eventually the Romans. And then, anyway, so in the very beginning, Judah Maccabeus' father, Mattathias, he gave a long speech. And in his speech, he used language very similar to the language that Yahshua used when he said, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's and render unto Elohim what's Elohim's. And that's really what the reference is to. So in other words, Yahshua was kind of responding, give as good as you get, but ultimately your observance towards Elohim is what's going to matter more. And there's some other things, other nuances in that we don't have time to go into today. But but the bottom line is you have the steady succession towards judgment of the temple, right? And as beautiful as it was, and it was indeed very beautiful. Matter of fact, Josephus, who was a historian and a Roman general, he was a Jewish general, but under the Romans, and he's considered one of the ancient historians. And he wrote about the temple, and he essentially said, if you've never seen the temple, you've never seen beauty before, right? It's an old rabbinic thing. If you haven't seen the temple, you've never really laid your eyes on something truly beautiful. It was just so impressive, and because it was the center, literally, right, of the culture, it was everything to the people, and but so much reliance was being placed on the temple and this complex of the temple, and Yahshua said, this temple is not where you're supposed to be giving your allegiance, right? It's not. I'm just conveying the main idea there. It's not the temple complex, right? It was like in the time of Jeremiah, where the people were saying the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, and yet they were doing all kinds of corruption and evil and all kinds of sin. And Jeremiah says to them, why are you placing so much emphasis on this building? When the tabernacle was in Shiloh, what good did it do them? And again, I'm heavily paraphrasing, but the bottom line was that the temple was not the thing. The temple was the thing that led to the thing, right? And the same thing here with with Herod's temple. The temple was not the thing, and Yahshua was trying to explain to the people there that the temple is the thing to the thing. So why am I taking so much time to go through this introduction about the temple? Well, because this entire chapter in Mark 13 is really pointing to that. It's pointing to the ultimate destruction of the temple, which we know historically occurred in the first Jewish war against the Romans, which went roughly from about 66, when the Romans started making their way through Judea, and then eventually culminated in the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era. And then it went a little bit beyond that, because then you also had the Maccabees who went not the Maccabees, I'm sorry, where'd that come from? You had the Jewish resistance that went into into Masada. That's the word I was looking for, not Maccabees. And then eventually in 73 Common Era, the Romans laid siege to Masada, and then that was the end of the Jewish revolt. But 70 was the point at which the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed, and with the destruction of the temple, that pretty much broke the back of the Jewish people because of how central the temple was in the life of the populace. So it's important to understand all that in its context so that we have a better sense of the import of what Yahshua is telling them here. So this is just a couple of other pictures here. This is the Temple Mount as seen from the east and northeast. And this one as well, a little closer view. So I think that's good for now. So let's, here's what I'd like to do before we delve into Mark 13. I want to start by reading the three different accounts that you see in the Gospels because they're parallel to one another. So I want to start with Mark 13, and then I also want to read Matthew 24, and I want to read Luke 21. And then after we've seen all of those in broad context, then we'll go back to Mark 13, and then we'll start looking at it in a more methodical manner. And remember, as we go through this, that Mark is probably the earliest of the three, and Matthew and Luke more than likely would have used the account of Mark as the bedrock upon which they built their own accounts later. At least that's what most scholars have agreed is the case. So I'm going to put Mark 13 first on the screen, and we will read that, and then we'll go to the others. All right, Mark 13, beginning with verse 1. And try to take in the whole panorama, right? And then we'll do the same with the other two chapters. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Yahshua said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" And Yahshua began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. When they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who is on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. And the one who is in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it may not happen in the winter, for those days will be a time of tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which Elohim created until now and never will. Unless Yahweh has shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Messiah,' or 'Behold, he's there,' do not believe him. For false messiahs and False prophets will arise and will show signs and wonders in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed. Behold, I have told you everything in advance. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. And I just want to insert very quickly here that rather than he, it is likely that the translation should more properly here be it is near, right at the door. But we'll talk about that later. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It is like a man away on a journey, who upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. And then let's go to Luke next. And that's over in Luke 21. And I want you to remember, as you listen to these different versions, their audiences, right? So Mark, as you recall, was more than likely written to the brothers and sisters in Rome, of which there would have been a mix of Jews and Gentiles, but mainly Jews. And then Matthew would have written mainly to Jews who knew the scriptures very well. Luke would have written mainly to Gentiles, not exclusively so, but mainly to Gentiles. So therefore, there is or at least a mix that included more Gentiles than the others would have. So you'll note certain things within the text that will be interesting because of the various audiences to whom these things were written. So we'll begin with verse 1. Luke 21:1, and he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a widow putting in 2 small copper coins, and he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. They questioned him, saying, Teacher, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, see to it that you are not misled. For many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified. For these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It would lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. It's very interesting. It's very detailed. But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. So I'll just point out, since we're here, so in the other accounts, you see that it said, when you see the abomination of desolation. Well, the abomination, or the abomination that makes desolate, or some such language. When you see that, that's a very specific reference to what? Well, to Daniel chapter 9, right? So if you're not a Jew and you don't understand these things, if you're a Gentile, abomination of desolation doesn't really mean a whole lot to you, right? But if you say, so Luke explains it a little differently. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, right? Now that makes sense to people because they don't really understand abomination of desolation. So when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. I want you to notice that too. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. We'll come back to that. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because there are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So notice how the differences, right? The similarities and the differences and how all this is written. There'll be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Okay. So notice it doesn't say he is near, right? It says your redemption is drawing near, which is a different concept. Then he told them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they put forth leaves, you see it, and know for yourselves that summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, recognize that the kingdom of Yahweh is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all things until all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Be on guard, so that your hearts will not be weighted down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life. You know, and dissipation is like, says there, like drunken excess, right? Like you have a hangover, right? Be on your guard so that your hearts will not be weighted down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of life. And that day will not come on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who dwell on the face of all the earth. But keep on the alert at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. And then we'll go to finally to Matthew, and specifically to Matthew 24, which is probably the longest. I'd have to count the verses, but I think this is the longest. It says, Yahshua came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So here you have identified two different things. I want you to note that, right? What will be the sign of your, tell us when these things will happen, right? What are these things? Well, what have they asked him? If they've asked him about the temple buildings, and he says, there's not going to be a stone left upon another. It's going to be all going to be torn down. When will these things happen? In other words, the destruction of the temple, right? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And I want you to notice that word coming and go down to the lower left there. And the Greek word is parousia, okay? Which means coming or means presence. and we'll get back to that concept a little bit. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. So if you look at the term end, the word is sunteleia, and it means consummation, like the consummation of the age. So when you say uh, the consummation of a particular act, you mean the completion of that act, right? So, and pardon the that I go to this example, but it's the only one that really vividly comes to mind at the moment. When you say that you consummate a marriage, what does that mean? Right? When you consummate a marriage, it means that you engage in relations with your partner for the first time, in which case you've both now committed to one another in the most intimate way possible, right? So that's a consummation. Well, when we're looking at the consummation of the age, the completion, the perfection, right? The consummation, and then this word age, aion, is typically translated eternity, but it's also, it can be an age, the end of the age. So the consummation of the age, that's important as we go through all this. So we have these things that are happening, and then the sign of your coming, that's something that's sort of can be either way, right? It could be to these things. What will be the sign of your coming? What is that about? Well, we'll have to look at that too. And at the end of the age. And how is the sign of his coming related to both these things and the end of the age? And that's where a lot of confusion and angst of understanding the text typically lies. Let's keep reading. And Yashar answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Okay, and when you look at the word end, it's the word telos, which is the end, the goal. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Okay, so any woman who has given birth knows the beginning of birth pangs, right? Matthew verse 24:9. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. There's that word telos again. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days have been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe him. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your master is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. For I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, my master's not coming for a long time, and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, so let's go back to the text, and now let's go back to Mark 13, having read all three sections. And we'll begin to parse this little by little. Now, before we go into there, I want to say a few general things. Let me just dispel a few notions right from the get-go, okay? If anyone is hoping to come away from this discussion with absolutes in terms of what the interpretation for these passages mean, then I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. And the reason for that is because the text is open to interpretation, and people smarter than I am have serious issues in discussing these things because it's not always clear exactly what's being referred to. So please understand that we're not going to have a definitive answer on these things from the sessions that we're doing now, right? What I'm giving you at this time is my best understanding of the text based on the things I've been studying and based on how I've weighed the text and how I've weighed the Greek and other things, okay? But I think that when people get, and this happens, by the way, and I've mentioned this before, this happens with all of prophecy as far as I'm concerned. People tend to get very dogmatic about what they believe about prophecy, and I think that that's a terrible mistake. I've been serving Yahweh now for over 30 years, and I can tell you that I've heard multiple interpretations of various prophecies in the scripture, and who's to say that one's interpretation is better than the others? Well, some of them make a stronger case, but then you come across new information, whether because of language or because of something that you run across in the cultural aspect of the thing that's being discussed, and it just totally blows out of the water the interpretation that you had before. That's just the nature of studying, coming across reference materials, etc. So why am I saying all this? Because I don't want people to get the impression that my word here is I consider it the last word. And quite frankly, within a couple of years, if I come across additional information or if I understand the language better and I come across better sources, I might thoroughly change my mind on something. And I'm going to reserve the right to do that, as you will reserve the right to believe or question what I say, right? So I just want to be really clear about that, because it's important. Anyone who tells you a corollary to that is that anyone who gets dogmatic and says, no, this means this and this means that, and he's totally wrong with this, I'm sorry, they're lying to you. Okay. And maybe not consciously or willingly, intentionally, but nevertheless, they're lying to you. Scholars are all over the place with these interpretations. Same thing with the book of Revelation, right? If you remember when we went through the book of Revelation at Tabernacles a couple of years back, there was a lot that we said, okay, this could be this or this could be that. So please take all of this and hold it loosely, right? Another thing I'll say is that when we start focusing so much on the particulars, it's very easy to lose sight of the bigger picture, okay? And from my perspective, the bigger picture with the Olivet Discourse, which is what this is called, is either referred to as the Olivet Prophecy or more scholarly, the Olivet Discourse, because this is the fifth of the discourses that you see, and at least in Matthew. I'm not sure how it works. It doesn't work out that way in all the Gospels, but it's one of the discourses. It's an important one. So what is the point of all this? Is the point to perfect exactly what the timing is for everything, or it's going to happen exactly this way as compared to this way? No, because we're told that no one knows the day or the hour, right? So the point is to be prepared. The point is to lead lives that are respectful and honoring of Almighty Yahweh, because Yahshua could come at any time, right? Theoretically speaking. So that's the main point of all of this, is to lead your life in such a way that you are honoring Yahweh, that you're looking out for your neighbor, that you're connecting intimately with your Elohim. And as far as the particulars, exactly how it happens, don't worry about that. That's not up to us. That's up to Yahweh. That's up to Yahshua. Okay. All right. So with that in mind, let's start going through this. The ways in which people look at these texts generally fall into three camps, and just generally speaking, right? There are all kinds of shades in between. But there is a view which is known as the historicist view, historicist, like history, right? And the historicist view essentially says that pretty much everything that you see written in the Olivet Discourse was intended conveyed events that had their complete fulfillment in the first century Common Era. In other words, its history is done. And by the time of 70 Common Era, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, all these things took place and it was done. That's the historicist view. Then you have what's known as the futurist view, which I think, in my opinion, most scholars, particularly evangelical scholars, tend to gravitate towards that view. And the futurist view essentially says that most of these things are future-oriented. Yeah, there are a few things that apply to the temple, but to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but essentially most of these things have yet to take place. And they tend to believe that point of view in conjunction with the way that they interpret the book of Revelation. And there's a whole doctrinal thing which is known as dispensationalism. They essentially says that there are different periods of history or dispensations where this occurred and this occurred and this occurred. And on the timeline of biblical prophecy, we are at this particular dispensation, and and there are things that are yet to come at a future dispensation. Okay. So when we looked at the book of Revelation, we considered some of that. And you may recall that I deviated from that. I don't view the book of Revelation in the same way that I used to, because I used to hold to dispensationalist type thinking, and I no longer do, for various reasons that I won't go into right now. But the bottom line is that the camp that I tend to fall in is sort of somewhere in between, which is, I think, referred to as mediative or something of that nature, or something medial. And I think that that's a more conservative view. I certainly don't believe either of the extremes. I do not believe that most of this is leading towards the future. I just don't see that, because the text doesn't really convey that. But neither do I believe that everything was done and completed by the first century. That makes zero sense to me, because there are some things that are written here and places like, in Acts chapter 1 and in the book of Revelation that convey ideas, and Paul, some of Paul's writings, First Thessalonians, etc., that 1 Corinthians 15, there are too many writings other than what you find in the Olivet Discourse that indicate a future fulfillment that makes sense with some of the things that Yahshua is mentioning here. But I honestly believe that it is sort of a mix. And when you look through the text, you're going to see that he kind of gravitates seemingly back and forth between the different viewpoints. So it's very hard to pin it down. It's very hard to say, where does this one end? This one being the stuff that happened by 70 Common Era, and where does this other stuff begin? It's not as clear cut as people would make it out to be. It just isn't. And anyone who tells you otherwise is, in my opinion, being, either willfully ignorant because they want to hold on to pet doctrines, or they're being intellectually dishonest, or they're just not seeing it, right, to give them the benefit of the doubt. So with that in mind, let's go on into it, and then I'll explain some of these things as we go through, okay? All right, so as he was going out, Yahshua, as he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, behold what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." This pretty clear cut, right? There's no question about that. And all accounts essentially give the same account. So they're leaving the temple. So remember, everything in context. So they've been in the temple. They've been, Yahshua's been having the discussion with the teachers of the law. And, in 11, the money changers, right? That discussion, he's already been, so context-wise, he's already been talking about the ultimate destruction of the temple. In other words, the temple had become a symbol of corruption to the point where John the Baptizer couldn't even fulfill his ministry there because it had become so corrupted with the teachings that were, and the viewpoint that was being promulgated there. So Yahshua had already, in the actions that he took, whether it was driving out the money changers, or whether it was the cursing of the fig tree, right? So the cursing of the fig tree was essentially the cursing of the condemnation of the temple, right? And the temple cult, right? The system that upheld that temple, it was done, because it was not fulfilling the purpose for which it was supposed to be there, which was to unite heaven and earth. Instead, it was being used for division, right? A splitting of Jew and Gentile, and people were sinning. It was kind of an Isaiah 1 situation, and Yahshua was saying the temple service as is known now, it's done. So he was proclaiming judgment against the temple. Driving out the money changers was not a tantrum on Yahshua's part. Driving out the money changers was not just a simple symbolic act of being angry and speaking against commerce because they're making money on the temple grounds. No, it's much, much deeper than that, much more profound than that. It was essentially saying this system that you have relied on is done, and Yahweh's going to judge it, because it's kind of like the Jeremiah, breaking the pottery, right? And saying, in the same way that this is broken, this is, that kind of thing. Or prophet ripping the mantle of somebody, saying, so has the kingdom been torn from you, that kind of thing, right? That's what Yahshua was doing. It was a prophetic event, which is why the teachers of the law were so offended by him, because they saw it in the spirit in which they weren't dumb. They saw it in the spirit in which he gave it. And in addition, there are other ramifications that we have to consider, some of which were understood by that time, others not until after his death and resurrection. And that is that Yahshua took the place of the temple. He is our temple. When we hear people talk about, well, the third temple has to be built in order for the Messiah to return, all that's just, forget about the third temple. I'm not saying that you might see that in some prophetic sense, but is it important for us that a third temple be built? No, it is not. Why? Because we're not looking to a third temple for our salvation. Yahshua is our temple. Yahshua is where the Spirit of Yahweh from which the Spirit of Yahweh emanates, and to whom we direct our allegiance and our loyalty, not to a building, not to a building complex. Yahshua fulfilled the sacrificial system, right? This is the whole point of the book of Hebrews and the gospel accounts of Yahshua's death and resurrection, is that whatever was done at the temple was fulfilled. I don't want to say supplanted, because people say that all the time. They say something like, well, the sacrificial system was done away with. Well, yes and no. I never like when people say that the sacrifices and everything was nailed to the cross. No, I understand what people mean by that, but you really need to be accurate about this. The temple sacrifices were not done away with. I don't like that terminology. They were given their fullest expression in Yahshua the Messiah, is what happened. Because there still remains a sacrifice. It's just not a physical animal sacrifice with all the attending rituals and washings and everything else. That's clear from the scriptures, particularly places like Hebrews. So it's through Yahshua that we have those sacrifices fulfilled, but it wasn't done away with. It was absorbed, if you will. It's kind of not the word I'm looking for, but I think you understand. It's spiritually fulfilled in Yahshua the Messiah, and we can prove that through various texts in Galatians and elsewhere. Okay, so the place where this is why Yahshua was so adamant about showing compassion and mercy and forgiveness. Compassion and mercy and forgiveness are a great part of the restoration project that Yahshua employed, right, on behalf, and continues to employ on behalf of people, on behalf of humanity. It's in other words, when you wanted to have forgiveness, what did you do? You came to the temple and you offered your sacrifices, and you were reconciled to Yahweh through the blood of those animals and the different things that they had to do, and ablutions, and what ablutions. So ablation is something different. Well, the snow's really coming down. I don't know if you guys have snow your way, but anyway. But now you don't do that through animal sacrifices. You do that. You come to Yahshua for forgiveness, right? And the book of Hebrews is really detailed about this. So in many different ways, Yahshua is the place where heaven and earth comes together, because the story of the Bible from Genesis forward is the story of Yahweh wanting to live with mankind, right? He's trying to come to live with us. Emmanuel, right? Elohim with us. It's the intimacy that existed in the Garden of Eden that was disrupted, that was broken because of the fall of man. And the whole story of the Bible is the reconciliation between Yahweh and his creation, mankind, beginning with mankind and continuing with all of creation. It's new creation. So the old fades away and the new takes over, the new that is uncorrupted. And the temple was just a tutor leading to people to understand the connection between Yahweh and his people and his desire to live with us, because you put a house there and he lives with you, right? It's symbolic. It's what you see in John 1:14, where it says that speaking of the Savior, that he tabernacles. He lesser versions say he dwelt among us, but if you really, well, all versions pretty much say that, because they don't say tabernacle, but the accurate word there is he tabernacled among us, because he is the temple, he is the tabernacle. Okay, so let's go back to the text. And Yahshua said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." So as wonderful as they are, he's telling the disciples, don't get too used to this, because as wonderful as they are, and they were, they're not going to last for very much longer. So don't put your hopes in them, right? It's like I said in Jeremiah, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh. Don't put your hopes in the temple of Yahweh, because the temple is not the temple itself. It's what the temple represented. Verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, and they have a great view, they're looking at all this, his inner circle is there with him, right? We're not necessarily told that in the other versions, but this one specifically tells you Peter, James, John, Andrew, the two sets of brothers, essentially. They were questioning him privately. So this privately type motif is throughout the book of Mark. We've seen that several times where he takes them aside privately, or privately they ask him about the interpretation of a particular text, and now he's telling them again. So they questioned him privately, saying, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? So as I've already said, when will these things be? Well, these things has a context. The context was just told us, right? There's nothing here about the end of the age. When are these things going to happen? When are the stones going to be torn down, the one from the other? What's going to be the sign when those things happen, when these things are going to be fulfilled? And Yahshua began to say to them, and then he starts explaining how that's going to happen, how it's going to come about. He says, see to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. So this is interesting, this construction here. And we're not going to really spend a lot of time on this, but many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. So does that mean they're going to come in the name of Yahshua, using Yahshua's name? That's possible. It might be a scenario where false people will essentially be saying, they'll be claiming Yahshua as their own, but then they'll do things that are contrary to to Yahshua's will. So as we go through this, remember, we're going to take this leisurely. Let's go to Acts 19, verse 11. Elohim was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons were even carried from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out. But also some of the Jewish exorcists who went from place to place attempted to name over those who had the evil spirits the name of the Master Yahshua, saying, I adjure you by Yahshua whom Paul preaches. It's an interesting way of formulating it, right? Not that they believe in Yahshua himself, but hey, it's a magic charm, right? It's a good luck charm by the guy that Paul preaches. They don't really believe in him, but I adjure you by, because they think it's it's an amulet, right? I adjure you by Yahshua whom Paul preaches. 7 sons of one Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. And the evil spirit answered and said to them, I recognize Yahshua and I know about Paul, but who are you? And the man in whom was, in other words, they had no authority, right? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them and subdued all of them and overpowered them, so that they fled out of that house naked and wounded. So they messed around and found out, right? This is what happens when you're doing something that you don't understand and you're using it as a good luck charm. And Simon kind of did the same thing, Simon Magus. But anyway, so that's just one example of how that might play out. Many will come to my name saying, I'm he, and will mislead many. But it could also mean many will come in my name, as if you're saying, not in his name per se, in the name of Yahshua, but in their own authority, saying, I am he, right? And will mislead many. It could be that they're just coming in their own name, meaning in their authority, and then they're saying, I am he, I'm the Messiah, and will mislead many. We don't really know exactly. It could be, the Greek could be read differently. Doesn't matter. The point is that that whether they're coming identifying Yahshua but then doing their own thing, or whether they're claiming themselves to be the Messiah or something special, then don't follow them. Right? That's the point. That obviously they're not him, and don't follow him. Okay. So false messiahs. That's one thing. You'll see that in greater detail in places like Luke and Matthew. Do you see the changes when I'm doing the changes? Okay. So if you're following along in Matthew, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Messiah. See that? I am the Messiah. It actually expands upon that, and will mislead many. And indeed, there were many false messiahs that came during that period, during the first century Common Era. For example, there was this one guy who was a military figure during the first Jewish war against the Romans between 66 and 70. His name was Giora. Simon. His name was Simon ben Giora, Giora. And he was widely viewed by some people there as the Messiah. And whoever put their faith in him put the faith in the wrong person, because he was eventually caught and he was executed by the Romans. And You see that many times. You see later, beyond 70, beyond this, you had Bar Kokhba, in much later, and he was viewed as being the star, Bar Kokhba, and he obviously wasn't the Messiah. And there have been many false messiahs. And just during this period of time, between Yahshua and the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, you had Messiah. So there was fulfillment that was happening. That word fulfillment is very important, particularly when it comes to prophecy. And I want to say a word about that, because people, again, when they look at these interpretations, not just about the Olivet Discourse, but also just about prophecy in general, people want to believe that fulfillment means, well, it's done and it's fulfilled and it's all over. And sometimes that happens, but more often than not, and I think this is the key point as we look at this, more often than not, there are what I call resonances, right? What does it mean to resonate? Well, if you hear a sound in an echo chamber, it resonates, right? You hear the original sound, but then you also hear the resonance of that sound. And I believe prophetically that you see resonances all throughout history. And some of those resonances are relatively mild, but some of them are incredibly significant. And I believe that we see that that in Mark 13 and in the other accompanying passages, that those resonances tend to be very important, and that those resonances are being described in these accounts. So there are things that are being fulfilled here. So, you look at that first thing there, see that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will mislead many, indicating false messiahs. So once the temple was destroyed, did that end false messiahs? No, right? I just described one of them that happened many years later, 30, 40 years later, with Bar Kokhba. He was a false messiah. And there have been many since him. Okay? To the present day, there are false messiahs out there. I remember the one dude, I hesitate to use the name, but I remember he used to call, I don't know if you guys remember that, 20, 30 years ago, he used to call himself Yahweh ben Yahweh, right? Yulan Mitchell, and I never forget that. And he turned out to be a murdering, you know what, and him and his people. And eventually, thank Yahweh, they took them down. And I've known of others in Texas and other places, right? David Koresh is a false messiah. In fact, his name, right, David, which is the son, like David, that wasn't his real name. David Koresh. It wasn't his real name. I forgot his real name, but it wasn't David Koresh. So David was the Davidic component because he wanted to, he's dead now, of course. He wanted to claim Davidic lineage, right? And then Koresh is just the Hebrew word for Cyrus, right? And Cyrus was the one who came and liberated the Jews, Cyrus the Mede or Persian. And he's the one that liberated the Jews from after the Babylonian captivity, right? So David Koresh is another false messiah, right? And on we could go. So false messiahs haven't stopped. They continue. What are those? Those are resonances, right? So as you see these things, you're going to find resonances. But that being said, you cannot. What have I told you is one of the main rules, perhaps the major rule of Bible interpretation, not just prophecy, but any Bible interpretation. It has to first what? The text has to first what? It has to mean something. It has to have meant something to the people to whom it was originally written, right? You can't just say, well, this was meant for someone 2,000 years later in history because was it 600 years later? Was it 1,000 years later? Was it 2,000 years later? No, it meant something to the people to the audience, maybe audience is not the right word, but to the reader, the original reader, it had to have meant something to them first. And then if there are resonances after that, then the resonances continue. This is why, for example, people get in trouble with some of the messianic prophecies because they say, well, that wasn't referring to Yahshua because it was referring to Hezekiah or to this one or to that one. Well, yeah, it may have been referring in its original context to Hezekiah or someone else, but it has resonances to Yahshua later in history. You see that all the time. You see that with Moses. You see other, people are compared to Moses, or something that happened to Moses, or something that happened to David in particular. You see resonances later that people say, oh, that's David, right? So that should not be a surprise, but it has to first mean something to the original audience to whom it was written. And I say all that because it's particularly important to understanding the Olivet Discourse that there is an original context. And the original context for all these verses that I'm reading you right now are leading up to the destruction of the temple, because that is the context, right? Context is king. That is the context of all of this. Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Boom. That's the initial problem, right? That's problem. Maybe problem is not the right thing. Assertion. That's the assertion. Oh, when are these things going to happen? What's the sign when these things are going to be fulfilled? What things? These things. What's these? The stones being thrown down of the temple, the complex being destroyed. And that's significant because that means something. It's the whole thing that's been leading up to this, is that Yahshua has been saying that this corrupt system, this corrupt temple system, is coming to an end. And the true temple is among you. Let's keep reading. So many will come in my name. Verse 7, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. So every time that there's a war, particularly if there's a war in the Middle East, right, like it's happening the last couple of months, every time there's a war in the Middle East, so, oh, this is the end times, right? People will go off the rails. No, people do tend to do exactly what Yahshua said not to do, right? He said, when you hear of wars and rumors of war, there's always been wars and rumors of wars. And when people go nuts about that kind of thing, they give credence to the naysayers. Because the naysayers see that, they see the panic and they see the apprehension, and they see people going off the rails and becoming unhinged about things, spiritually speaking. And then what does that do? It feeds their mockery, right? Their sense of mockery and sense of superiority. Don't do that. Don't feed into people's natural inclination to disrespect the word of Yahweh. And hear wars and rumors of wars. You know what? Let your ear go up. Watch it. Keep an eye on it. But don't panic about it. There have always been wars and rumors of wars. And that's what they will say. Well, there have always been wars. Then you get the attitude that you see over in 2 Peter, where, well, it's always been like that since time. Well, nah, not like this, not in this particular configuration. But don't argue with people like that. There are wars and rumors of wars. There always have been, and until Yahshua returns, there always will be. But what does he say? When you hear of these things, do not be frightened. Don't get excited and anxious about it. These things have always happened, and they're going to happen. Because when evil is involved, because when you have the forces and the elements of evil, what does it lead to? It leads to violence. It leads to war. It leads to false claims of having the answers, like these false messiahs. None of that is anything new. That's existed from the beginning in every age, right to the present day. So those resonances are going to continue. But he says those things must take place because they've always taken place. And because it's just naturally, like I say, it's a natural outgrowth of evil, because that's what evil does, right? Evil makes a mess. Evil is chaos. Evil is what? Evil is, and wickedness are the chaotic forces of nature that go all the way back to Genesis, right? It's back to tohu vavohu, empty and waste, empty and void, and chaos. So don't get panicky about those things. But that is not yet the end. See, he says those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. And that was as true in the first century as is going to be true beyond the destruction of the temple in 70 Common Era, and going all the way to the present day, all the way through when Yahshua returns. Because in fact, we're told in Zechariah, places like Zechariah 14, or Zechariah 11, sorry, that 12? Anyway, Zechariah. We're told in Zechariah that Yahshua is going to return in the time of war, right? And we're told that in the book of Revelation as well. So none of that should be surprising to us. And they do this with other things as well. For a nation will rise up against nation. When has that not been the case in all of human history? All of human history. The nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, always, right? There will also be famines. And then another one talks about, I think in Matthew, it talks about plagues, right? Oh, we just had one, right? With COVID. And, and of course, as soon as COVID came up, immediately the voices of came up and, oh, we're close to the Messiah's return, and this is the punishment, and this is judgment. Don't get caught up in those kind of things, because in my opinion, that flies in the face of Yahshua's admonishment to not get caught up in that kind of stuff, because it's all part of the death throes, right? All of that. The wars, the rumors of wars, the earthquakes, the hurricanes, the violence, the increase in violence, every time you look in the news, the way that people do to each other, right? Hamas and all the evil that they've done, etc. Is it all of that upsetting? Sure it is. Of course it's upsetting. But none of it should either surprise us or derail our faith or cause us in any way, shape, or form to have overt anxiety about what's happening, because Yahshua said these things must take place, right? And he said, furthermore, these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So when he says these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs, I believe that that's more of a reference to this initial thing that he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. These things, when you start seeing these things and hearing these things, although they've always existed even before that period of time, right? But when you start seeing these and you see them picking up, these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. So, ladies, right? I don't have to tell you, when you start feeling that, are you typically, unless you like waited a long time and kind of ignored stuff, do you give birth right away when you start feeling the birth pangs? Not likely, right? Most of the time, you go into labor, right? And not even. Maybe you start getting birth pangs, weeks or months in advance. Maybe they're false and maybe they're not. And if they're not, they have to work with you to make sure that you come to term, right? And all that. But when you start feeling them, they're the beginning of birth pangs. They're not even the birth pangs. They're the beginning of birth pangs. So what is the implication? That there's a long stretch that we have to go here. These are the beginning of birth pangs. But like he said, the end is not yet. It's not yet the end. So when you consider that word telos is the end, the goal, well, the ultimate goal is new creation, right? Is the end of this present system and the birth, right? We're talking about a birth in terms of the metaphor, the beginning of birth pangs. What are you giving birth to? And by the way, that's a very, very common metaphor in Jewish Jewish writings and in biblical writings in particular. The concept of a birth pangs. What are you giving birth to? You're giving birth to a new world. You're giving birth to a new creation, right? These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs, but it's not yet the end. There's still things that have to take place. Okay? But he wants to give them a sense of when these things are going to start to come to fruition so that they're not taken aback, so that they're not caught off guard, right? So he says, but be on your guard, be aware, always be aware. And he starts going into some detail, right? For they will deliver you to the courts, and you'll be flogged in the synagogues, and you'll stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them. So there's going to be pain involved in giving testimony about me, right? You'll stand before governors and kings. And note that it's interesting that they're going to stand before governors, not just before everybody publicly, but before governors and kings. It means that what they're doing is going to carry great weight because they're going to be standing before pretty important people, right? So yeah, it's going to be in the common, it's a given that they're going to be despised and rejected by the common people in the synagogues. But they're also going to stand before governors and kings, which is indicating that the message is going to be that important that it's going to rise to the level of governors and kings. And then you might also want to consider synagogue and on the one hand, and then governors and kings on the other hand. Well, what do governors and kings represent? That represents government, right? Herod, right? And then synagogues, that represents what? Religion. So that represents the Pharisees, the scribes, right? And everything in between from then until now. So religion, you're going to come into conflict with religion. You're going to come into conflict with politics, with governments, right? With civil authorities, with religious authorities, with civil authorities, and all of it's going to be for the purpose of testimony to them, you see, okay? The gospel, the good news, the evangel, must first be preached to all the nations. When they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. So, and it's interesting because this is, I think, is it the first time? No. So the Spirit's been mentioned, but not with the configuration Holy Spirit. It's been mentioned in conjunction with the dove, right? But not directly identified as Holy Spirit. But here it says plainly, for it is not it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. When you look at the Matthew version, excuse me, it's interesting because he says, and we don't really have time to go through all of Matthew, but if we compare these side by side, it would take us maybe 6 lessons to go through it, right? But he says, if there's an important point, I'll go back to Matthew or Luke. So make up your minds. This is Luke 21:14. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves. See, the persecution, verse 13. Let me read this from verse 12. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. And we see this happening. All of this, everything that we've read so far, false messiahs, everything in the book of Acts. So it didn't begin in a future time. It began right then and there. From the moment that Yahshua was executed and raised from the dead, they started to have, they were being thrown before the rulers and flogged and put in prison. Remember that? And then they were brought before kings and governors. They were brought before Felix and before, Pontius Pilate. Well, Pilate, not them, but they were brought before people. Paul was brought before Festus, etc. It would lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So persecution, it stinks, but it leads to an opportunity for testimony, which is the point, right? So when you look at the book of Acts, one of the things that when I first started to really look in depth in the book of Acts, one of the things that impressed me in a very great way was that the thing that accounted for the greatest spread of the kingdom message was what? It was persecution, right? Once you get to Acts chapter 8, actually from the point where Stephen is stoned and moving on forward from there, the very thing that we're trying to do to squelch the apostles and disciples backfired. And then they had to flee from Jerusalem and from the environs of Judah, and that pushed them into Samaria and then beyond to all kinds of areas, right? So it was the exact negative thing in terms of persecution and the hatred and the rejection that caused them to go all over the place and give incredible witness to the point where we are today, right? Which is where all the world, whether they agree with it or not, is not the issue. All the world knows about Yahshua the Messiah in some way, shape, or form. It's like Paul said, right? Whether they're talking good about him, whether they're talking trash about him, they all know he's being preached, right? So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom, notice, I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. So he doesn't say the Spirit, he says I. Well, how's he doing it? He's doing it through the Spirit. We haven't been introduced to the Spirit yet in Luke, right? Because it comes towards the end where he says, wait, and Yahweh's gonna send you the Spirit. But that is what it is. The Spirit is the Spirit of Yahshua, right? It's the Spirit of Yahweh. It's the Spirit of Yahshua. That's what it is. It's the Holy Spirit, okay? Which is the mind of Yahshua that is given to us to be able to accomplish these things. So going back to Mark, and by the way, we'll just go till 5 o'clock and then we'll continue next week. So he says, the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. And he says, when they arrest you and hand you over, don't worry, because it's not you who speak, but it's the Holy Spirit. And then verse 12, brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. And children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, and the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. So people worry and they say, well, is this something that's going to happen in the future? Well, maybe, right? Because there's precedent for it, because it happened, but it began in that period. All of this is that period before the destruction of the temple. He's describing to them what to look for. In other words, when you start seeing the forces of evil, wickedness, of the darkness, which is what's motivating all this, when you start seeing those things happen, you know that that destruction is near. Okay. But there are also residences. I wish it would have just ended there and be done with, but we know better than that. We know that Christians have been persecuted forever. We know that Jews have been persecuted forever, right? We know that people persecute other people, especially religious people. So I wish I could say that these are things that we don't have to worry about. And when people ask about these things, and when is this going to happen? And when is this going to happen? That's really what they're looking for, right? People are looking for assurances. I understand that. I get that. Because there's a mindset that if we know ahead of time, then at least we can do something about it. We have some level of control. And to an extent, that's partially true, but then it's not fully true either, right? So, so I think one of the important things of looking at all this is to come to terms with the likelihood that a number of these things are also going to have resonances in our time, including persecution. Thank Yahweh, so far, we in the United States and the West in particular have not really experienced that, but that could change, right? The kind of things that the Jews experienced happened overnight. And by the way, if those forces, we better continue to pray for Israel, the nation of Israel, right? Because we're not talking here about accepting doctrinal whatever and differences. No, but people don't understand that the war that Israel is fighting is a Western war. It's not just for Israel. And the level of hatred and anti-Semitism that exists out there, I'm not saying this to be political, it's just a reality of the situation. And anyone who doubts that, give me a call and we can have that conversation. If Israel does not defeat these forces, they're going to be on our shores. And who knows if they're already there, right? That situation that we have at the border, right? Again, I don't want to get political here, but who knows who's coming in? Who knows if there are sleeper cells that are waiting to be activated? We don't know. We take too much our safety for granted, in my opinion. And we need to know that there are things that are happening. There are forces in play that are agitating, and we have to be aware, and we have to continue to pray and ask Yahweh to continue to guard us and shield us. So continuing here. So you can be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Okay, there's that word telos again. Then beginning at 14, you see, but when you see the abomination of desolation, where does that come from? Well, abomination of desolation is a detestable thing that it means something, but the word abomination means something detestable. And this comes straight out of Daniel 9:27. And I will go there in a minute. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. What is this little insertion here? Let the reader understand. Well, when was Mark written? Mark was written more than likely in the late 60s, common era. Remember that the first gospel account, it would have taken time to compile, and it was not completed until almost 30 years after Yahshua's death and ascension. So enough time had gone by to think these things through and to compile these things, to get all the notes together and the eyewitness accounts, etc. And then this was written around 65 Common Era. Well, what was about to happen? Well, in 66 Common Era, I said the Romans began to make their way into Judea through Galilee, etc., and eventually, to Jerusalem. and they put down a Jewish rebellion. And they completed that in 73, but by 70, this is only pointing to around 70, to the destruction specifically of the temple. So if Mark was written in 65 and this war began around 66, obviously there were things going on, right? It didn't just overnight someone said, hey, let's lead a revolution against Rome. This has been brewing for years, and they're planning it and everything else, and they're agitating here and there, and who knows what all the history is. And then by 66, the Romans were actually taking action and doing something about it. So let the reader understand, the reader in 65, they're probably seeing all these things going on like us, right? They're watching the cable news shows, and they're hearing all these things and all these rumblings of things that are going on, and this here and this here and this thing in Galilee and that thing there, and they're wondering what's going. Well, let the reader understand, right? In other words, in Yahshua's moment with the disciples, none of that is happening, at least not to this degree. Right? This is reaching a fever pitch, but that's why it's a parenthetical. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, hey, you reader, you're years after this was spoken to the disciples. You're reading this now. So understand, the stuff that you're seeing around you is exactly the stuff that's coming to fulfillment that he spoke of 30 years ago, right? That's the implication. Then when you see this abomination of desolation where it should not be, and where is it that it should not be? Well, it shouldn't be in the temple, right? Because something holy should be in the temple and in the temple precincts. And by the way, when they talk about the temple up here, the term is hieron. You see it down there in the lower left, hieron. It's not referring to the temple proper, which in other words, just the building. It's referring to the entire temple complex. So as he was going out of the entire temple complex, they're looking at all the buildings, right? That's why it says buildings, plural, right? It's not just the main temple proper. It's the whole complex. So when you go back down here, so when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be is in the temple complex, right? And we'll talk about what you should do when you see it. So what happens when you see it? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But let's take a look at Daniel 9 for a moment. And I'll start bringing this to a close. And we can continue next week, y'all. So we won't go through the whole prophecy here, but it says, verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. This language is all tied into Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So this language is coming from here, the shikuts and the kanaf shikuts, the wing of abominations. It's also referring to, so it's Daniel 9:27 language, but it's also a reference to, remember, residences, right? This here in Daniel is itself a residence of something that's already occurred. What occurred? Well, I mentioned it earlier in the book of Maccabees, right? Book of Maccabees is not a biblical book. It's what's known as apocrypha. It's extra biblical, but it provides accurate historical information about what the Jews went through. And there was, in fact, an abomination of desolation that was put in the temple. So Daniel's looking at that and saying, yeah, there's going to be a similar type of thing to that, right? In his prophecy. And this is what Yahshua is referring to. So we're gonna stop here, and I want to start from that point, Yahweh willing, next week, 14, and we'll start with taking a quick look at the book of Maccabees to get context. And it's interesting because remember, I said in the previous chapter, in chapter 12, that Yahshua had quoted, not verbatim, but he had alluded to, maybe it's a better term, he had alluded to that statement of Mattathias, who was the patriarch of the Maccabees, who used similar language. Because it was all prophetic, right? What he was saying, he was saying to them, "You see this coin? This is the one who is going to be, who is essentially going to tear all this down. So you're going to give back as good as you get, but more than that, you're going to, because he already knew that they were going to be revolutionaries. He was trying to dissuade them from that. So if you keep reading there in Mark and in Matthew, he says, flee, right? You know, let's just read that real quick. He says, when that happens, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So people will take this, again, the futurists, and they'll use all this stuff. The ones on the housetop, go and don't get your coat, and woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing. Everyone gets in a tizzy because they think, oh, all this is going to happen yet in the future, and tribulation and all that. And it's not like that. And I'm saying, because these things already occurred in the first century leading up to 70. But always with all of this, are there residences? Probably, right? Sadly. Okay. But all this actually has already happened, because all this is context leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in particular. So we'll talk about, so going back to the coin. So Yahshua saying he already knows that there are people who are going to want to fight back. And he's essentially saying to his disciples, don't fight back. There's a battle you can't win. It's going to happen anyway. So don't fight back, flee, hide. And then he's already saying in 12 to the people who are going to be going along with this, hey, I know you're going to do this anyway, so give as good as you get from the Romans. But the people who want to serve Yahweh, give Yahweh honor and glory, because he's the one to whom you ultimately owe your allegiance. So you're going to go in this direction. It's folly, but go ahead, because that's what's already, you've purposed to do that in your heart. But the more important thing is to give honor to Yahweh and to give your allegiance and your loyalty to him. Okay. All right. So I'm going to stop here with verse 14, and Yahweh willing, next week we will start there and continue. And then we'll see that beginning around verse 24, then there's question about whether he's talking about the past of the stuff that's already happened, or whether he's talking about a time yet in the future. And the answer, it could be either or, right? It could be either or, could be both. It's like if you're, the analogy that I've heard, at least two scholars offer, if you're standing at a location where you could see mountains, and you have a really big mountain, and then you have other mountain ranges in front of that at different intervals, it all looks like it's sort of meshing together, right? But it's not the end, right? It's not the big mountain at the end there. So 24 forward starts to really point towards the big mountain, but you're still seeing the other mountain ranges in front of it. So there's going to be some overlap here and there, right? All right. So we're going to leave it there. I'm hoping that this is comprehensible so far.